Hello, everyone, and welcome back to this episode of the Healing from Lyme Disease Summit. My guest today is Dr. Nэнsi O'Hara, and I always love when I get to interview my friends and colleagues, and I've learned so much from Dr. O'Hara over the years. She's a board-certified pediatrician, expert in PANS and PANDAS and neurodevelopmental illnesses, things like autism, OCD. She's been doing this for, I won't even say, many, many years and has a lot of experience. So Dr. O'Hara, thank you so much for joining the summit.
Thank you, Darren. Really pleasure to be here. And thank you for all that you do. I've learned a lot from you too. So appreciate it.
So, you're a pediatrician, you obviously work with a lot of kids. Maybe let's talk a little bit first about Lyme in kids. Is there something different about children that we see in adults that, parents who are watching this really need to maybe tune into that, like, hey, I never really thought that this might be affecting my kid. Now, what are something that might be a little bit different with kids than we see in adults?
Yeah, I mean, one of the things is they can present with Lyme with gastrointestinal symptoms, with diarrhea. 80% of children do not have the classic erythema multiforme, erythema migrans, other types of rashes. They just don't have that. And as you know, children are resilient. So a lot of times they can get a tick bite, they're running around, and we don't even suspect that that bite has happened. They don't really get sick as we might as an adult with an acute infection. So a more chronic presentation where it comes on many weeks later can happen. Or we think that initial presentation of fever, is just another virus that they got. I think the other thing that I always want to remind parents of is Lyme can be transmitted gestationally. And so in the children with neurodevelopmental problems, we always ask about mom's history. And we
Right.
always look to see if mom could have had Lyme disease, even if she didn't know it when she was pregnant, and if that could be transmitted onto the child and be part of their overall chronic illness or neurodevelopmental illness. So I think those are the ways it presents differently.
Yeah, and I know, you and I both work with a lot of children with autism, and there's so many features that often get chalked up to being autism. And I'd love to hear your experience. I mean, my experience is that I see a lot of symptoms that get attributed to being autism get better when we treat Lyme and these co-infections. I don't think I've ever had a child where their autism completely went away, but I think, when kids start toe walking or have some of these behavioral issues, it's amazing how many of these things get better when you treat Lyme. I mean, has that been your experience as well?
Absolutely. Yeah. And I think that, autism is always blamed for things. It's part of the allopathic name it, blame it, tame it kind of medicine. And autism is really about getting at the root causes. And for some of the children, and I used to think it was a very small percentage. I think it's a much greater percentage of that, but we really don't know. But for some of them, it is Lyme disease. And I think the most important thing for moms thinking about getting pregnant is to first figure it out for themselves, because
Right.
that's when we can make the most impact. And I agree with you that treating Lyme can help these children with autism to get better. It's all about timing, severity, all of that about how much better, but it's something that should definitely be looked at.
Yeah, I'm guesstimating on my practice. It feels like about 30% of kids I see on the spectrum have Lyme or some co-infection. Again, when we treat, we do see clinical improvement. And I was talking to our friend Dave Dornfeld, and I think he kind of felt it was about the same. So,
Yeah.
I mean, nobody really knows, but that seems to be the number that I've kind of hovered around.
Yeah, I think that's a fair ballpark.
So, what is your approach? When you have a child come in and you've identified that they have Lyme, either clinically or through lab tests, what's your thought process of, like, where do I really need to start? And I know, I know acute Lyme disease is a little bit different, assuming that most of the people we see do not have acute Lyme disease. But for someone who might have had this for a while, or maybe this is a gestational transmission, what's your thought process of where do I need to start with this child?
Yeah. And you know, as you said, I've been doing this for many years, actually many decades at this point. But you know, because I tend to have a longer waiting list, I don't see anybody with acute disease. It's all chronic disease.
Yeah.
And the last 15 years of my practice has been really dedicated much more to PANS, the pediatric abrupt onset neuropsychiatric syndrome. And Lyme disease can be part of that. It can come on abruptly, but it certainly can be much more subacute and chronic also. And the most common that we see is Bartonella as a co-infection. So I'm still always looking at the three-pronged approach. You know, is there still a trigger that we need to get rid of? And because it's chronic, I am a big believer in herbs. I really don't like to use antibiotics. I think we often make guts worse. We can cause many more problems when we use multiple antibiotics, as is needed in treating Bartonella, for example. They have their place, but I'd much rather look at herbals, either from Booner's protocol, Caldon's protocol, Beyond Balance, but many different protocols, or individualizing, as I like to do, for each child. And then I look at, this is an immune system problem. This is not just a spirochete problem. In chronic Lyme, the immune system has been affected. So what immune support do we need to give? What anti-inflammatory support do we need to give? And then what are the biggest symptoms in that child that it's causing? You know, if it's Bartonella, is it rage? Is it joint pains, muscle pains, heel pains? Is it Lyme and chronic fatigue, brain fog? And treating that symptom, again, with nutraceuticals, botanicals, herbals, long before medications that may help that child to get better.
Well, I couldn't agree more, and that's been my approach. And like antibiotics have their place, but I couldn't agree more that the disruption to the gut, and with all the research that's come out about how important our gut flora is in modulating not just your immune system, but weight and metabolism, cardiovascular health. I mean, pretty much everything. And, we put that at risk, every time we give an antibiotic. And sometimes, again, it's necessary, we have to
Right.
do that. But if we don't have to do that, why not try something that might be a more gentle first? And if it's not giving you the desired result, you can always step up that ladder a little bit. But my experience, having treated thousands of Lyme patients, including a lot of children with herbs, they work incredibly well. And I've probably written 10 prescriptions for antibiotics in almost 25 years. So
Yeah.
this idea that herbs aren't as strong, as antibiotics aren't as effective, that usually comes from people who don't know herbs, aren't trained in, and don't really use a lot of them. For those
Right.
of us who do, we see the value and the benefit. And, we also don't run the risk of damaging the mitochondria, which a lot of antibiotics do. And particularly
Absolutely.
for kids with special needs, a lot of them, if not most of them, have, some element of mitochondrial dysfunction. We just throw gas on that fire and have the potential to make things so much worse.
Yeah, excellent points. And the other thing I would say is, you and I both agree, low dose, whether it be low dose immunotherapy or low dose in general, in starting, helps to avoid the Herxheimer or die-off reaction. So the other advantage of starting with herbals is we can start very low. Their full dose may be 30 drops, but we can start with 1 drop and move up slowly, so to avoid severe Herx reactions.
Yeah, and I'm always amazed the number of people who at one drop of one herb, start to herx, start to get some sort of activity, and sometimes it's a good thing. So,
Right. Totally
sometimes
agree.
a little goes a long way. And and if you're someone again who maybe doesn't have, you've got bad genetics, you don't detoxify very well, you probably find you're sensitive to a lot of things. And so I like the less is more approach of, let's go in with kid gloves, very low doses of everything. And it's amazing how many people respond at those low doses. Well, I want to talk a little bit about, one of your areas of expertise, and that's, PANS and PANDAS. You wrote a book called Demystifying PANS. And for those who are maybe new to this concept, can you just describe a little bit about what this syndrome is?
Sure. In the 1990s, Sue Sweeto and others coined the phrase PANDAS, pediatric autoimmune neuropsychiatric disorder associated with strep. And these were children that developed abrupt onset of neuropsychiatric symptoms like tics, OCD, anxiety, after a strep infection. It remained very controversial. And I think Sue herself would say today she wished she had called it the Sweeto disease rather than pandas, as many men might have done, present company excluded, but, and made it less controversial. But in 2012, the white paper came out where Dr. Sweeto and 30 other clinicians and researchers got together to try to make it less controversial and coined the phrase pediatric acute onset neuropsychiatric syndrome. And this was to include other triggers, mold, metabolic problems, mycoplasma, Lyme, viruses that could also trigger OCD or severe restrictive eating disorders, and had two other things with it. So separation anxiety, your 11-year-old who all of a sudden won't go to sleep or go to school without, won't leave your side, emotional lability or an abrupt onset of depression, irritability, aggression, as I said, rage with Bartonella, behavioral regression, where all of a sudden they're talking baby talk, the abrupt onset of ADHD or other school performance problems, tics, handwriting deterioration, and then the two other ones that are really pathognomonic or is one of those together with a somatic symptom, like restless sleep or bedwetting when they were previously dry, or urinary frequency or other symptoms. And so it's really a very prescribed diagnostic criteria. And I think one of the problems is we have coined very, cutesy, kitschy kind of phrases. And the other problem is we don't stick to the strict criteria. So when I talk about it, there are a lot of children with autoimmune encephalitis, many with Lyme disease, many with mold disease. If it's not abrupt onset, it probably shouldn't be coined as PANS. But that doesn't mean it can't be treated in the same way, treating with the three-pronged approach of antimicrobials, anti-inflammatories, and symptom treatment. And from my perspective, that's a functional medicine approach to it. So.
Yeah, can you talk a little bit about some of the immune mechanisms involved in PANS? I know it's kind of, nerdy, geeky stuff, but I think it's really kind of fascinating. And I know you talk about this in your book, but can you just help people who might be interested in that, kind of understand what these mechanisms are?
Yeah, absolutely. I think that it's sometimes easier to understand it from the pandas strep infection standpoint, but think about it like if you get strep throat, what should happen in your body is these antibodies or immune proteins should attack the strep in your throat and help you get through the disease. But instead, in a percentage of children, 1 in 200, where the immune system is dysfunctional, those cytokines, immune modulators, antibodies, instead of attacking the strep in the throat, instead have molecular mimicry, where they attack a part of the brain. And specifically, that's the basal ganglia. So sometimes it's the first expression, sometimes it's repeated exposure to group A strep, and that results in these pro-inflammatory cytokines like Th17, Th1, all of these sort of things attacking the microglia or that part of the brain that releases inflammatory cytokines. And these cytokines also break down the blood-brain barrier. So you get an infection in your throat or in your sinuses, the blood-brain barrier is attacked or broken down, and then there's molecules like antibodies that easily get into the brain and cause the inflammation. And so when that inflammation occurs in those specific areas, there's anxiety. If it's in the amygdala, there's tics. If it's in that area of the caudate putamen, there's OCD. And that's really what's leading to the symptoms. We can't go in and do a brain biopsy, nor would we want to, but that's what's happening on a very microscopic level that then produces the symptoms that we see.
I've always thought it was so fascinating with strep. And of course, strep's just one example of many microbes that are part of us.
Yeah,
I think this idea that again, it's a foreign thing like Lyme, potentially that shouldn't be there. Although I might argue that Lyme is probably a more common organism than people realize.
yeah,
Again, it's just a function of the immune system just not understanding, what's part of our world and not part of our world. But this idea again that we're going to kill our way out of this problem, if it's part of you, it's just not going to happen.
right,
So we've got to step beyond this idea that it's again just about killing Lyme. It's just about killing strep. It's just about killing the bug. And we've got to
right.
evolve to realize that there's all these other underlying issues that we need to address. And we've talked so much in the summit. I mean, Dr. Moorcroft and I talked about this. I talked about this with Dr. Antoine. It's really about the terrain that, we've got to get healthy. Getting a healthy gut, getting rid of your toxicity, getting out of the moldy environment. Right now I'm in a temporary office because we had mold on our own office and we had to get out.
Yeah.
It's a huge problem all over the world. So as as certainly parents of children, but if you yourself are dealing with Lyme and co-infection, again, I think you need to think a little bit broader on the approach. So, you talk about this three-pronged process with PANS, antimicrobials. Let's talk just a little bit. I want to hear, you kind of rattled off some of the herbs that, you and I both use, but maybe let's talk about some specific herbs for people so they can kind of think about it. Do you have particular, maybe like your top 3 or 4 herbs that you tend to use quite a bit of?
Yeah, so with Borrelia and Bartonella, I love Japanese knotweed. Japanese knotweed is a wonderful herb, naturally with resveratrol, which is a wonderful antioxidant that helps with inflammation. But Japanese knotweed is probably my go-to when I'm thinking about Borrelia and Bartonella. I also really like Cryptolepis.
Mhm.
Great for mycoplasma, great for babesia, has some effects in Bartonella also. So those 2 I really think about a lot. I also tend to use a lot of mushrooms, cordyceps, for example, in supporting the immune system. When I'm thinking about strep, I love herbals like neem, usnea, tega, which is a pine needle extract from the Siberian forest. Silver, colloidal silver can be very good. Also good against mycoplasma. Another one I like is Isatis. And I'm not a great pronouncer. You never want to go to me for the pronunciation of anything. So if you want to pronounce it differently, please tell me, Darren. But I love that for mycoplasma, which is often very hard to treat, as well as for Bartonella. We've had great success with that one in some of our chronically deteriorated mycoplasma kids. So those are some of the herbs. There are many others I use. When you're talking about the gut, one of my main mentors is Dr. Sidney Baker. And Sid, really taught me a lot about yeast. And when we talk about the gut, a lot of these kids that come to us on multiple antibiotics have dysbiosis and often have yeast overgrowth. So I'm also, if I've got a kid with yeast overgrowth that I'm also thinking about strep or mycoplasma, I may well consider oil of oregano. Grapefruit seed extract is another great one in Borrelia, as well as yeast. Caprylic acid and multi products also that may have many herbs. So, I would love to give 1 or 2 to all the parents out there, but for me, it's about looking at the child in front of me. And sometimes, as I train new naturopaths or nurse practitioners or allopathic students, they say, well, which herb? I want to use this one because you used that one last time. And I'm like, nah, I just get a gut feeling it's going to be this one. And I say, pun intended, I'm going with my gut. Let's treat this one for this gut. So.
Well, the one thing that's really cool about herbs is that they do so many different things. Herbs are comprised of numerous chemicals, constituents that, they might have some that target, helping eradicate the bug. But again, they're anti-inflammatory, they help promote better circulation, they help support parts of the immune system. So we really can mix and match to find the right combination for each person. And if you guys are interested, Dr. Zhang, Z-H-A-N-G, who's
Yeah.
a researcher at Johns Hopkins, he and our friend Jacob Leone have done a lot of research on different herbs and how they affect Borrelia and Babesia and Bartonella. And it's kind of interesting, like the ones you mentioned: Japanese knotweed, Cryptolepis, Chinese skullcap,
Yeah.
Artemisia. They come up kind of over and over. And I was at an event with Dr. Cowden, Lee Cowden, who's worked a lot with Nutrimedics on their products. And I remember he was giving a lecture and he talked about these herbs being keep herbs. He goes, "That's a keep herb, that's a keep herb." And I'm like, "What do you mean?" He goes, "Well, it kills everything except people." So, a lot of these herbs, again, they're not just antibacterial, they're antiviral, they're
Right.
antifungal. So I find I really never have to give an antifungal when I give herbs, because the herbs themselves are antifungal. They help keep that, it's not killing off just bacteria that allows the yeast to overgrow. So again, I think it has a better effect on the gut of not being that selective, but it's selective enough that it targets the bad bug that we're trying to get rid of. And just to add to your list, I'm a big fan of cat's claw. I use a lot of
Oh,
cat's claw in my
absolutely.
practice. I use a lot of Artemisia. I use a
Yep.
lot of Petunia. I
Yep.
use a lot of Andrographis. So, I
Yep.
mean, there really is a smorgasbord of herbs. And that's when I sit down with patients. I said, "Look, we've got plan A, B, C, D, E, F, and
Yep.
G if we need it. We just need a place to start." And
Right.
so, the one thing I think that happens too often in Lyme and really PANS treatment is, we want quick results, and there's that knee-jerk reaction. If I don't see it within 2 weeks, 3 weeks, let's bail and go on to something else. And in my practice, I give everything 2 months. I think
Yeah.
2 months is a fair shake to say it's, is it moving the needle in the right direction? I know other doctors, it's a little shorter, a little longer, but you do have to give it time to do what you want it
Yeah.
to do.
And I think, several wonderful points you brought up on that. The first one being the verbiage I use is, this is a marathon, not a sprint. Don't think because you've walked in this door that your child's going to be better tomorrow. And I think setting those expectations, saying to somebody who has a 7-year-old that it may be gestational, this may have been developing for 7 years, let alone, you're not going to come in here and see it better in 7 days. So
Right.
setting those expectations are so important. And I also agree with you, 2 months is reasonable. Sometimes it's 1 month, sometimes it's 3 months. I usually say 3 months, because if they're better at 2, great. But, and I may change it before that time, depending on the individual child. But if I set that expectation of a little bit longer, then they're happier when things get better sooner, or happier when I change it up a little bit sooner if I feel differently about it. And then the third thing is with the herbals, you're absolutely right. Multifactorial, many different benefits, both in the numbers of germs and the antioxidant, anti-inflammatory components. And I also like it together with a biofilm buster. If they're
Right.
not getting better initially, again, if it's chronic, adding an enzyme 15 to 20 minutes, sometimes up to 30 minutes before the herb, gives that extra benefit that may help to open this up and get them better. And it works much better with herbals in the biofilm protocol than it does with antibiotics. So,
Well, another plug for herbals, which I think is interesting. Again, almost all the research is in vitro. They don't really do human studies because there's just no money behind it. But at least in vitro, we do find that most herbs will kill Lyme in particular, and even Bartonella. Bartonella doesn't change forms like Lyme does, but we know like doxycycline only addresses Lyme when it's in its adult kind of uncoiled, spirochete form. When it balls itself up into its round body form, it doesn't do anything. Where
right.
herbs do, they actually do kill it. So it doesn't matter what stage Lyme is in, herbs still have an opportunity to get rid of the bug, where something with doxycycline, you know, doesn't. And doxycycline only works when the bug is replicating.
Right.
Right. It's not a bactericidal
Exactly.
antibiotic. It's bacteriostatic. It just stops it from replicating. So it still depends on your immune system's ability to, contain it and eventually eradicate it. So just one more
Absolutely.
food for thought of, why herbs I think are a great thing. Your second prong is dealing with inflammation. Of course, with PANS, pandas, this is the big problem. It's a brain on fire.
Yeah.
What are your thoughts again on, how do we control inflammation? Do we need to go right to the steroids and NSAIDs, or are there other options?
Yeah, many other options. So, I'm not anti-NSAIDs, often giving 10 milligrams per kilogram of ibuprofen when a child is in a flare, when a child is having a tantrum or having a horrible reaction with tics, et cetera, can prove that behavior is inflammatory.
Right.
And can help to decrease the symptoms in the immediacy of the moment. But there are so many other things to try before steroids or IVIG. You're the expert on low dose immunotherapy. I will let you speak to that, and won't try to give my nubbins of success. But others that I love are certainly turmeric, curcumin in many different forms. You mentioned Nutrimetics with Dr. Calden. One of the Nutrimetics products I love is Avea,
Yeah.
which is a wonderful bioavailable form of turmeric. Others, as I mentioned, antioxidants like resveratrol, things that Alyssa Song talked about, like specialized pro-resolving mediators with COVID, have been very, very helpful. Flavonoids like quercetin, that Theophorides talks about a lot, have been wonderful. Low dose naltrexone that's used in MS and other diseases have been very helpful to some of the kids. And then one, of course, that Sid talked to me about and harvests in his own lab are Hellman therapy.
Right.
The HDCs, the Hymenolipus diminutus. I'm not spelling that for your listeners, but that's going back to, what are we trying to do? We are trying to develop immune tolerance, immune resiliency, and starting with the gut. So each of these things in different ways helps to reset that gut, where our immune system starts. 70% of the immune system starts in the gut. And so we have to work on that. And one more thing, not to go on and on, is it starts with diet. If all we're eating is junk, rather than real food, sugars, carbohydrates, processed foods, our guts are not going to get better. So, I do try to talk about the gut a lot, and diet a lot. I've been coined the diet doctor by some of my patients, because no matter who they are, I don't let them get out the door without one simple change. Maybe taking the dairy away, maybe trying to replace a lot of the complex carbs with something else, maybe trying to add more protein or more oils or something that could start them on the path of improving their immune tolerance and then moving on to all these other anti-inflammatories.
Well, again, we've got so many different tools in our tool bag that we can use to control inflammation, integrate. I mean, there are times where kids are so out of control that sometimes you need the ibuprofen, sometimes you need the steroids. And again, we have a lot of kids where it helps. Is that the end of the saga? No. But if you've got a child that's hurting themselves, hurting you, at risk of, running out in the middle of the street and doing something that might be very dangerous, you got to fight fire with fire. And sometimes these other things we're working on take time to really get that inflammation under control. So don't be shy if it gets that state of using heroic medicine. That's what it's there for. But it's with the understanding that that's a stopgap treatment, and that we continue our work in doing all these other things as you described.
Exactly. Yeah. And a couple other points about steroids. You're absolutely right. It's a temporary fix. They, and something to be used when they're in dire straits. Absolutely. But if, like we were talking about before, they're yeasty or have dysbiosis, those are kids that can definitely get worse rather than better. So it can be a diagnostic trial also, if you're not sure what's going on for a child. If they get better, inflammation is absolutely part of it. If they get worse, we should be looking more at other forms of dysbiosis that may be causing problems that we might not have thought about before. So,
No, could not agree more. Well, third point is about helping support the immune system. So what are some of your favorite ways to help support the immune system?
well, all of the ways we just talked about in supporting the immune system, diet, first and foremost, curcumin, resveratrol, et cetera. But I think the third one is also treating the symptoms, that are there. And with OCD, one of my favorites is NAC. N-acetylcysteine is very helpful. I think the biggest problems are NAC is easily oxidized when exposed to air. And so putting each daily dose in and also getting up to a high enough dose. A lot of times, whether it be inositol, which is another great one for OCD, NAC, we don't go to a high enough dose. Treating the symptoms, if it's tics, magnesium may be great. And that can be also wonderful if they also have constipation or trouble sleeping. If they have anxiety or under stress, I'm a big believer in adaptogens, ashwagandha, rhodiola, holy basil, all of those can be very helpful. I'm a big believer in CBD, which, as you said, can be great for immune support and also wonderful in decreasing anxiety. That Avea we mentioned, great for immune support, but also great in calming the nervous system and bringing down the anxiety. I've used that as often as every hour in the acute situation to bring down the anxiety or symptoms that the child may be expressing. So a lot of these interventions, again, when we talk about herbals and nutraceuticals, they have two sides to them. And they're not just, treating the germ or treating the inflammation. It's also about treating the symptom.
Yeah. Well, again, there's so many natural things that we can use to mitigate each of these different symptoms. Like I said, the anxiety and the tics, the sleep problems. And again, sometimes you do have to cycle through different treatments to find out what works best. I mean, again, in the herbal world, we have a lot of great herbs that we call nervines. So they basically help calm the nervous system down. But the nice thing about them is that they're not generally sedative. So we don't necessarily want to turn, your child into a zombie where they, are just lethargic all day and they're not functioning. But we've got herbs like passion flower, lemon balm, chamomile, kava, California poppy, again, there's a lot of them, and a lot of them come as glycerate tinctures. So for kids that might be sensitive to the alcohol that are in a lot of herbal tinctures, there's a lot of companies that make them as glycerate. So they're sweet flavored, like the passion flower glycerate's delicious. It actually tastes really good. And
so's the
getting kids
lemon
to
balm.
take it is super easy. So there are some herbs like valerian that are pretty nasty. It's hard to get valerian as a tincture, but lemon balm and passion flower. And again, a lot of these are pretty easy to get into kids. They tolerate it quite well. And again, clinically, they work very well.
Yeah, absolutely. And when you talk about something like lemon balm, again, not just a nervine, but also a wonderful antiviral. And in this era of COVID, but also in this era of many other viruses rearing their ugly heads in virulent forms this season, whether it be RSV or norovirus or others, viruses are a big trigger in our kids that may have Lyme in the background or strep in the background. The viruses are what bring about the flare. So I'm always looking at things that may help us decrease the viral load or the viral replication, as well as treat the underlying symptoms.
Well, I don't think any talk with PANS would be complete if we don't at least talk a little bit about IVIG. I know that you're not using really a lot of it in your practice much anymore, but can we at least talk a little bit about what it is and why might this be helpful for someone dealing with PANS?
Right. IVIG is intravenous gamma globulin. And so again, we're saying there's an immune system abnormality. So we give immunoglobulins to reset that immune system. And in kids with moderate to severe symptoms, especially when it involves restrictive eating or when it interferes with activities of daily living, then we may well need to quickly, or if they're not getting better over time with other interventions, add something like IVIG. I work with immunologists to do it. We don't do it within our practice. It is very expensive and these days harder and harder to get insurance to cover. But in children with PANS or PANDAS of a moderate to severe nature, it can be very helpful. One caveat: if you use IVIG too early in our children that also have Bartonella or Lyme, that before treating those, they may actually get worse. So we always look for Borrelia, Bartonella, Babesia, and others as warranted prior to recommending or instituting IVIG, because we want to at least initiate the treatment for those before starting IVIG.
Great idea. I agree. It's like, for me, IVIG is kind of a last resort therapy. It is the human blood product. And just, as much as we test every blood product, there is still some potential risk. So again, it's in the toolbox. For me, it's in the back of the toolbox, but just to
Me
know
too.
that it's available. Because again, I have some kids, and you do too, that they've tried a lot of these other things, haven't had a lot of success. And then sometimes this is the thing that really moves the needle. So it's just good to keep an open mind that it's a possibility. But I think, if you deal with all these things that we just talked about, you'll probably find the need for IVIG is way, way down.
Yep, totally agree.
Well, this has been a fantastic conversation. I've learned a lot. You shared some great information. For people who might be interested in wanting to connect with you or your clinic, what's the best way for folks to find you?
Yeah, my website is dro'hara.com. Since I've written the book, which is available on Amazon, I've also been on social media. Glad to always see you there, Darren. Instagram, it's NH O'Hara MD. LinkedIn and Facebook, it's Nэнsi O'Hara MD. MPH, FAAP, etc. You'll find me. But I have several wonderful colleagues in my practice, Dr. Lindsay Wells and Dr. Erica Smith, who are great naturopaths, and Vicki Kobliner, who's a wonderful dietitian, all of whom you can find via my website also. And we're just there to help anybody that needs it. So.
Well, again, I appreciate you taking time to spend with us and being part of the summit. So thanks, Nэнsi.
Thanks, Darren. Really appreciate it.